How avoidants treat the one they truly love versus the option. Imagine discovering that the person who seemed the most distant, the most confusing, and the most emotionally unavailable was actually fighting their hardest battle over you. Not because they didn't care, not because they wanted to leave, but because your presence reached places inside them that nobody else ever touched. The strange reality of avoidant psychology is that the person they truly love often experiences more confusion than the person they barely care about. The one they love gets mixed signals, sudden distance, emotional walls, and moments that feel impossible to understand. Meanwhile, someone who means far less may receive easier conversations, smoother interactions, and even more visible affection. On the surface, it looks backwards. It looks unfair. It looks like the avoidant is giving their best to the wrong person. But underneath that surface is a psychological reality that most people never see. Today we're diving deep into the hidden differences between how avoidants treat the one they truly love versus the option they keep around for comfort, convenience, or emotional safety. And if you've ever spent nights replaying conversations, wondering why someone who seemed to care so much could also seem so distant, this video may answer questions you've been carrying for a long time. Also, if you enjoy exploring the deeper side of avoidant psychology and relationships, take a second to subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it ensures you won't miss future videos that uncover the patterns most people never notice. One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to understand avoidance is assuming that love automatically creates closeness. For most people, affection naturally leads to greater openness, more communication, and a stronger desire for connection. But avoidants often operate according to a completely different internal system. Love doesn't simply activate desire, it activates fear, it activates vulnerability, it activates every emotional risk they have spent years trying to avoid. This is why genuine love can sometimes look strangely similar to emotional distance. The deeper the feelings become, the more complicated everything feels inside them. They may care deeply while simultaneously feeling trapped by that care. They may miss someone intensely while convincing themselves they need more space. They may crave connection while feeling overwhelmed by it at the exact same time. To an outside observer, this creates enormous confusion. People expect love to be obvious. They expect love to be consistent. But avoidants often experience love as an internal conflict rather than a smooth emotional experience. The person they truly love becomes important enough to hurt them, important enough to disappoint them, important enough to leave a permanent mark. And that level of importance can feel terrifying. As a result, they may create distance not because the feelings are weak, but because the feelings are stronger than they know how to comfortably handle. This leads to one of the clearest differences between the person they truly love and the option they keep in their life. The option feels safe because there is less to lose, there is less emotional exposure, there is less vulnerability involved. If the option leaves, it may be disappointing, but it usually doesn't shake the avoidant's entire emotional foundation. The one they truly love is different. That person represents risk, real risk. The possibility of rejection suddenly matters. The possibility of being misunderstood matters. The possibility of losing control over their emotions matters. This is why avoidants often seem surprisingly relaxed around people they don't deeply love. There is no constant emotional threat running in the background. They can be present without feeling exposed. They can enjoy the connection without constantly monitoring themselves. Ironically, the person who matters most often receives the most guarded version of the avoidant, not because they deserve less, but because they have the power to affect the avoidant more than anyone else. When real love enters the picture, emotional stakes rise dramatically. Every disagreement feels heavier. Every misunderstanding feels more dangerous. Every moment of closeness creates both comfort and fear. The option may receive convenience, the loved one receives significance, and significance changes everything. What many people never realize is that avoidants often invest enormous amounts of mental energy into the person they truly love. The stereotype suggests that avoidants simply don't care, that they move on easily, that they forget quickly, but internally the reality can look very different. The person they love often occupies far more mental space than anyone realizes. They replay conversations, they analyze interactions, they think about what was said and what wasn't said, they remember moments that seem insignificant to everyone else. While they may not openly discuss these thoughts, the mental investment can be constant. This creates another confusing contradiction. The avoidant may appear detached externally while being deeply preoccupied internally. They may spend hours thinking about someone they barely text. They may miss someone intensely while refusing to admit it. They may wonder how that person is doing while convincing themselves not to reach out. This hidden mental involvement is one of the strongest indicators that real feelings exist. The option rarely occupies this kind of emotional territory. The option fits neatly into their life. The loved one disrupts it. The option doesn't force deep reflection. The loved one becomes impossible to completely ignore, even when the avoidant tries their hardest to create emotional distance. And because so much of this process happens privately, the person on the receiving end often assumes the avoidant never cared as much as they actually did. Perhaps the most painful paradox of all is that avoidants can sometimes appear more affectionate with the option than with the person they genuinely love. This is where many people become completely lost. They watch the avoidant laugh more easily with someone else, they see them acting more relaxed, more expressive, more available. And naturally, they assume those behaviors indicate stronger feelings, but avoidant psychology doesn't always work that way. When emotional stakes are low, defenses stay quiet. There is no overwhelming fear of dependency. There is no deep vulnerability being triggered. There is no terrifying possibility of heartbreak hanging over every interaction. As a result, the avoidant can appear more spontaneous and emotionally accessible. The connection feels easier because there is less risk involved. The loved one, however, activates an entirely different emotional landscape. Every meaningful interaction carries weight. Every vulnerable moment feels exposed. Every step toward intimacy feels like walking closer to something both desired and feared. This can cause avoidants to become cautious precisely when they care the most. They may overthink messages, they may hesitate before expressing feelings, they may withdraw after moments of intense closeness. To the person experiencing it, this behavior can feel like rejection, but often it is evidence of emotional significance. The option receives the version of them that feels safe. The person they truly love receives the version that is wrestling with fears, vulnerabilities, and emotions powerful enough to change them. And throughout this video, you'll discover that many of the behaviors people interpret as lack of love may actually reveal just how much love exists beneath the surface. The deeper an avoidant falls in love, the more they find themselves confronting fears they thought they had mastered long ago. Most people assume love is supposed to feel comforting, but for an avoidant, genuine love often feels like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing there is no safe way back. Suddenly, emotions are no longer theoretical. They are real. They carry consequences. The person they love now possesses the ability to hurt them in ways nobody else can. This is why the loved one frequently triggers their deepest fears. Fear of abandonment, fear of being controlled, fear of needing someone too much, fear of losing their independence. Fear of revealing parts of themselves they have spent years hiding from the world. The option rarely activates these fears because the emotional investment is limited. The avoidant can maintain a comfortable distance while still enjoying companionship. But when real love enters the equation, the protective walls that once felt reliable begin to crack. And what emerges isn't confidence, it's vulnerability. Many avoidants have spent most of their lives believing vulnerability is dangerous. So when someone finally reaches a place inside them that feels exposed and unprotected, panic often follows. They may suddenly need space after moments of closeness. They may become harder to read. They may seem uncertain even when their feelings are strong. The tragic irony is that the person they love often interprets these reactions as evidence of disinterest, when in reality they are sometimes signs of emotional intensity. The closer someone gets to their heart, the more likely they are to awaken fears that have been sleeping beneath the surface for years. At the same time, something else begins happening that many avoidants never openly admit. They start paying attention in ways that surprise even themselves. While they may not constantly express affection through words, they often become quiet observers of the person they truly love. They remember details that seem insignificant. They notice shifts in mood that others miss. They recall stories mentioned months ago. They remember favorite songs, random preferences, childhood memories, little insecurities, and passing comments that were never meant to be important. This isn't because they are trying to impress anyone. It happens because their emotional focus naturally gravitates toward the person who matters most. The option may receive attention when present, but the loved one remains mentally present even when absent. The avoidant stores pieces of them without realizing it. A certain place suddenly carries memories. A certain phrase triggers a specific moment. A certain song brings them instantly to mind. Yet because avoidants often struggle with direct emotional expression, these observations remain hidden. The person they love may never know how much was noticed. They may never realize how carefully they were being watched, not in an obsessive way, but in a deeply human way. The avoidant's attention becomes selective. Out of all the people around them, one person begins occupying a unique place in their awareness. And while they may not openly declare it, their memory quietly reveals the truth. We rarely remember details about people who do not matter to us. We remember details about those who leave emotional fingerprints on our lives. As the connection deepens, another important distinction emerges between the option and the person they truly love. The option often receives a carefully managed version of the avoidant, a version designed to appear capable, self-sufficient, and emotionally controlled. Conversations stay within safe boundaries, vulnerabilities remain hidden, insecurities stay locked away. The avoidant maintains the image they want others to see, but with someone they genuinely love, maintaining that image becomes increasingly difficult. Eventually, cracks begin to show. The loved one starts seeing fears, doubts, contradictions, and emotional wounds that most people never witness. This process is rarely intentional. In fact, avoidants often resist it, yet genuine love creates a powerful pressure toward authenticity. The more someone matters, the harder it becomes to sustain a perfect mask. The loved one may catch glimpses of sadness beneath confidence. They may witness uncertainty beneath independence. They may see moments of emotional honesty that seem completely out of character. These moments are significant because they reveal access. The option often gets the performance. The loved one gradually gets the person behind the performance. And while this access can feel meaningful, it also creates tension. The avoidant feels exposed. Their carefully protected inner world is no longer entirely hidden. For someone who has spent years relying on emotional self-protection, this level of visibility can feel both relieving and terrifying. They want to be known, yet they fear what will happen if they truly are. That fear helps explain one of the most confusing patterns in avoidant relationships. The person they love is often the person they pull away from the most. On the surface, this makes no sense. Common logic tells us that people move closer to what they want. But avoidants often experience the opposite reaction when emotions become overwhelming. Intimacy creates pressure. Closeness creates exposure. Emotional dependence feels risky. So after moments of connection, they may instinctively create distance, not because they suddenly stopped caring, but because their internal system becomes overloaded. Imagine someone stepping into warm sunlight after spending years underground. Even something beautiful can feel overwhelming when it is unfamiliar. The avoidant may deeply enjoy closeness while simultaneously feeling the urge to retreat from it. This creates the hot and cold dynamic that leaves so many people confused. One day they seem emotionally present, the next day they seem distant. One moment they are opening up, the next moment they are pulling back. The option usually doesn't trigger this cycle because the emotional stakes remain low enough to feel manageable. But the loved one activates emotions powerful enough to challenge the avoidant's entire sense of control. Distance becomes a temporary strategy for emotional regulation. Unfortunately, the person on the receiving end often experiences that distance as rejection, creating pain on both sides of the relationship. And perhaps the clearest sign that someone occupies a unique place in an avoidant's heart is this: they change the avoidant's inner world in ways the option never could. The option fits into existing routines, existing habits, existing emotional structures. Life continues largely unchanged. But the person they truly love creates disruption. Suddenly, decisions carry emotional weight. Future plans begin including another person, even if only subconsciously. Priorities shift, thoughts become occupied, familiar routines feel different. The avoidant may try to maintain the appearance of complete independence, but internally something has already changed. They find themselves considering someone else's feelings, wondering what someone else thinks, caring about outcomes they once ignored. The loved one becomes woven into their emotional landscape. This is why real love often feels so unsettling to avoidants. It challenges the identity they have carefully built around self-reliance. It forces them to acknowledge needs they would rather deny. It introduces emotional complexity where simplicity once existed. The option can be enjoyed without transformation. The loved one creates transformation whether the avoidant wants it or not. And while they may resist that change, fear it, or even fight against it, the very fact that it occurs reveals something important. Some people pass through our lives without altering who we are. Others leave marks so deep that nothing feels quite the same afterward. For avoidants, the person they truly love is almost always the one who changes them from the inside out, long before they are ready to admit it. If there is one emotion that exposes the difference between the option and the person they truly love, it is jealousy. Not the loud, possessive, obvious kind that people often associate with insecurity, but the quiet kind that avoidants rarely admit exists. Most avoidants work hard to appear unaffected. They value self-control. They pride themselves on not being overly dependent on others. So when jealousy appears, it often stays hidden beneath layers of restraint. Yet when the person they truly love begins giving attention to someone else, becoming emotionally invested elsewhere, or simply becoming less available, something shifts internally. They notice, far more than they want to admit. The option may come and go without creating much emotional turbulence, but the loved one has become tied to hopes, fears, and emotional investments that run much deeper. Suddenly, the avoidant finds themselves paying attention to things they wish they could ignore. They may wonder who occupies that person's thoughts. They may compare themselves to people they normally wouldn't care about. They may feel unsettled by changes they cannot control. Yet instead of expressing these emotions openly, many avoidants retreat further into themselves. They hide the reaction. They rationalize it. They convince themselves it shouldn't matter. But emotions rarely disappear simply because they are denied. They remain beneath the surface, quietly revealing the significance of the connection. And often, the strongest jealousy appears not when the avoidant fears losing attention, but when they realize they may be losing someone who genuinely mattered. This internal struggle leads directly into another pattern that separates genuine love from casual attachment. Avoidants frequently fight their strongest feelings rather than embracing them. When emotions become intense, their instinct is often to regain control rather than surrender to what they feel. The option doesn't require this battle. There is little reason to suppress emotions that never become overwhelming in the first place. But the loved one creates emotional currents that feel powerful enough to disrupt carefully constructed defenses. The avoidant may try to explain away their feelings with logic. They may tell themselves they need less. They may focus on flaws in the relationship. They may become distracted by work, hobbies, routines, or responsibilities, anything that helps reduce the intensity of what they are experiencing. Yet the harder they try to suppress certain feelings, the more obvious those feelings often become internally. They think about the person more than they intended. They miss them more than they expected. They find themselves emotionally affected by interactions that should have been insignificant. This creates a strange contradiction. On one hand, they are trying to distance themselves from their emotions. On the other hand, those emotions continue shaping their behavior. The person they truly love becomes a source of internal conflict because love demands emotional honesty, while avoidance depends on emotional control. These two forces pull in opposite directions, and the resulting tension can last for months or even years. What looks like indifference from the outside may actually be a private battle between desire and self-protection. As this battle continues, another difference becomes impossible to ignore. The option remains on the surface of the avoidance world, while the person they truly love gradually gains access to deeper emotional territory. This process is usually slow, painfully slow. Avoidants do not open themselves overnight. They reveal themselves in fragments, one conversation at a time, one vulnerable moment at a time, one unexpected confession at a time. The option may know facts about them, but the loved one begins learning truths about them. There is a difference. Facts are easy to share, truths are not. Facts involve careers, hobbies, routines, and preferences. Truths involve fears, regrets, disappointments, childhood wounds, insecurities, and hidden dreams. The closer someone gets to these deeper layers, the more emotionally significant they become. And although avoidants often fear this level of intimacy, they also crave it. Human beings naturally long to be understood. Even those who spend years hiding parts of themselves still hope that someone might eventually see them completely and stay. The loved one slowly becomes that person. Not because the avoidant intends for it to happen, but because genuine emotional attachment gradually lowers barriers that casual relationships never touch. The option remains outside the walls. The loved one is eventually invited inside, even if the invitation is hesitant, inconsistent, and filled with uncertainty. But once someone enters that deeper emotional space, the contradictions begin intensifying. This is where many people become convinced that the avoidance behavior makes no sense. One week there is closeness, the next week there is distance. One conversation feels deeply intimate, the next feels strangely detached. One moment the avoidant seems emotionally invested, the next moment they appear unreachable. These contradictions become stronger around the person they truly love because two opposing needs are operating simultaneously. They want connection. They also want safety. They want intimacy. They also want protection. They want to be known. They also fear being exposed. Most people experience these desires in balance, but avoidants often experience them as competing forces. When connection wins, they move closer. When fear wins, they pull back. This cycle can create emotional whiplash for both people involved. The avoidant feels torn between conflicting instincts while the loved one struggles to understand what is happening. The option rarely triggers this level of inconsistency because the emotional stakes remain lower. There is less to lose, less to fear, and less vulnerability involved. But the loved one occupies a place powerful enough to activate every contradiction that exists within the avoidance emotional system. What appears irrational on the surface often reflects a very real internal struggle beneath it. And perhaps nowhere is that struggle more visible than in the way avoidants respond to absence. Many people assume that if an avoidant truly misses someone, they will immediately show it. But avoidants are often experts at appearing unaffected. They have spent years learning how to suppress emotional reactions. They know how to keep functioning. They know how to maintain routines. They know how to convince both themselves and others that everything is fine. Yet the absence of someone they truly love often echoes through their life in ways they cannot fully escape. Certain places feel different. Certain habits feel emptier. Certain moments unexpectedly bring memories rushing back. The option may disappear and leave behind a temporary gap. The loved one leaves behind a presence that continues existing even after they are gone. This is why avoidants sometimes seem strangely haunted by relationships they never fully processed. Long after the connection ends, the emotional imprint remains. They may not talk about it, they may not publicly acknowledge it, but internally the absence continues to carry weight. The person they truly loved becomes part of their emotional landscape, and removing them does not immediately remove their influence. In many cases, the avoidant notices that absence most clearly during quiet moments when distractions fade and there is nothing left to outrun. It is then that they realize how deeply someone became woven into their life, and how difficult it is to pretend that person never mattered. That realization sets the stage for an even deeper truth, one that many avoidants do not fully understand until much later. Some connections can be replaced, but others leave marks that remain long after the relationship itself has ended. Some people leave an avoidance life and become memories. Others leave and become chapters that never fully close. This is one of the clearest differences between the option and the person they truly love. The option can often be replaced because the connection never reached the deepest parts of the avoidance emotional world. There may be fond memories, there may be appreciation, there may even be sadness when things end, but eventually life settles back into familiar patterns. The emotional impact fades because the relationship never fundamentally altered who they were. The person they truly love is different. That person becomes woven into their internal story. Their influence remains long after the conversations stop, long after the routines change, and sometimes long after the relationship itself has disappeared. Certain lessons become attached to them, certain emotional breakthroughs become connected to them, certain fears, hopes, and regrets continue carrying their fingerprints. This is why avoidants sometimes find themselves thinking about one particular person years later while barely remembering others who once occupied far more time in their lives. The depth of impact matters more than the length of time. The option occupied space in their life. The loved one occupied space in their identity. And when someone reaches that level, replacement becomes nearly impossible. The avoidant may move forward. They may meet new people. They may build new experiences, but part of them quietly recognizes that some connections are unique, not because they were perfect, but because they changed something fundamental inside them. Ironically, the relationships that matter most are often the ones avoidants are most likely to sabotage. This is perhaps one of the most heartbreaking realities of avoidant psychology. When something becomes emotionally valuable, the fear of losing it can become so overwhelming that self-protection takes over. The avoidant begins looking for exits before there is even a threat. They create distance before intimacy becomes too intense. They focus on imperfections before attachment becomes too deep. They convince themselves that leaving first will hurt less than being left behind. From the outside, these decisions can seem irrational. Why walk away from something meaningful? Why damage something you clearly care about? But fear rarely behaves rationally. Fear is concerned with survival, not fulfillment. For many avoidants, emotional self-protection became a survival strategy long before they understood what love was. So when genuine love arrives, those old protective instincts often activate automatically. They may withdraw during moments that require vulnerability. They may create unnecessary conflict. They may become emotionally unavailable precisely when closeness is needed most. The tragedy is that many avoidants are not sabotaging relationships because they feel nothing. They are sabotaging relationships because they feel too much. The emotional significance becomes so overwhelming that retreat feels safer than risk. Yet every act of self-sabotage usually leaves behind the same painful realization. Avoiding pain often means avoiding the very connection they wanted most. Eventually, however, many avoidants reach a moment of clarity. It may happen during a breakup, it may happen months later, it may happen after meeting other people who simply do not affect them the same way, but at some point they begin recognizing that one person stood apart from the rest. One person created emotional reactions that could not be explained away. One person remained present in their thoughts despite every effort to move on. One person exposed fears they didn't know existed. One person challenged defenses that had worked for years. This realization is rarely dramatic. It is often quiet. It arrives slowly through comparison. The avoidant notices that new connections feel easier but not deeper. They notice that conversations happen but the emotional impact is missing. They notice that life continues yet something feels absent. Gradually, they begin understanding that what they experienced was not ordinary attachment, it was genuine love. And perhaps the most difficult part of this realization is recognizing it after opportunities have already been lost. Many avoidants understand the value of a relationship only after distance creates perspective. Once the noise of fear fades, they can finally see what was underneath it. They can finally separate their feelings from their defenses. And sometimes that realization becomes one of the most transformative experiences of their lives. When avoidants truly love someone, love often looks very different from what people expect. It is not always loud, it is not always smooth, it is not always consistent. In fact, it may contain contradictions that confuse both people involved. But beneath those contradictions, certain patterns emerge again and again. They think about the person more than they admit. They remember details that others forget. They struggle with vulnerability because the connection matters. They become emotionally affected in ways that surprise them. They return mentally and emotionally to the relationship even when trying to move away from it. Genuine love, through avoidant eyes, is often revealed not through comfort but through impact, not through ease but through significance. The option may receive convenience, attention, and companionship, but the person they truly love receives something much deeper, even if it is expressed imperfectly. They receive emotional investment, they receive internal conflict, they receive access to parts of the avoidant that few people ever see. And while these expressions may not always look romantic in the traditional sense, they often reveal a depth of feeling that runs far beneath the surface. So as we reach the end of this conversation, there is one final truth worth remembering. If you try to measure avoidant love using only visible behavior, you will often miss the bigger picture. That does not mean every avoidant secretly loves someone they treat poorly. It does not mean harmful behavior should be excused. And it certainly does not mean someone should stay in a relationship that leaves them emotionally exhausted. But it does mean that avoidant love is frequently more complex than it appears. The person they truly love is often not the one who receives the easiest version of them. It is the one who challenges their defenses, awakens their fears, occupies their thoughts, and changes their emotional world. The option offers comfort without transformation. The loved one creates transformation whether they are ready for it or not. And perhaps that is the deepest difference of all. The option fits into the life the avoidant already has. The person they truly love changes the life they thought they wanted. They leave marks that remain long after distance, long after silence, and long after the relationship itself has become a memory. Because in the end, the greatest sign that an avoidant truly loved someone is not always how comfortable they seemed while that person was there. Sometimes it is how profoundly that person's presence and absence continued shaping them long after they were gone.